Hello, in this video I'm going to discuss types of reasoning in argumentation. More specifically, we're going to go over broad and specific types of reasoning as well as common biases that influence our reasoning process, perhaps leading to inaccurate conclusions. So, first of all, when we talk about types of reasoning in forming an argument, really we need to kind of understand where reasoning comes in terms of the entire context of an argument. And so this goes back to something that you might have seen me discuss in prior videos dealing with so what are the components of a logical argument? So remember, a logical argument is supporting an argument or a conclusion, right, with evidence and or reasoning, right? So you have a conclusion, you have this claim, and you're going to support it with something. And then you're also going to have an unstated assumption, a warrant in that argument. So again, a claim is the conclusion the speaker is trying to support. Data is the proof used to support that claim. And then the warrant is the unstated assumption that connects all those two components together. So if you look at it again in this sort of sample model here, if I said the Blazers are going to win tonight, the Portland Trail Blazers, a team in the NBA, and I say the reason that they're winning is they're playing at home. That's my data, right? What's the warrant? What's the unstated assumption? It's that home teams play better in the NBA than teams on the road, that there's some sort of home court advantage. If that was not true, right, then my data or reasoning, which we're going to get to, would not make any sense, right? Because it wouldn't be relevant to the conclusion if whether or not you played well at home had any impact. If that had no impact on a team winning or losing, then that really wouldn't be a very persuasive piece of evidence, right? So in an argument, you have all three components, right? Now, where reasoning is going to come in a couple of ways. One way is it can just come in fundamentally sort of at the data component. So you have a conclusion, and since you don't have evidence, right? Since you don't have whether it's evidence, physical evidence, or like data in the sense of statistics, like some reason to reach that conclusion. Sometimes you don't have evidence, so you have reasoning, right? So in cases where you just can't get the evidence, right, or it's just not available to you for whatever reason. And so you might find some other way to connect the dots to reach your conclusion, right? And so that's kind of where reasoning comes into play, is in those situations. So that's what we're going to discuss primarily in this video, but I want you to kind of think about this in the broader context of an argument. And then as to where reasoning comes in to reach that conclusion. It's typically substituting for physical evidence or substituting for data. Now, sometimes, of course, the reasoning in and of itself also has some evidence mixed in, right? But you want to think of reasoning as sort of being that component that helps you reach a conclusion, just like in this case. It's essentially the data part of the Tolman model. So let's talk about some broad types of reasoning and some very specific types of reasoning. So at a broad level, you've got inductive, deductive, and abductive sort of reasoning. So let's talk about these first before we get into some more specific types of reasoning. So what is deductive reasoning? It's a logical process where a specific conclusion is guaranteed to be true if the general premises, aka the data used to form it, are also true. So, in other words, if A is true and B is true, then it inherently means that C must be true as well. So, to give you an example, let's say you determine that all humans are mortal. Turns out we are, right? And then you said, well, I am a human. So, based on those two pieces of information that you know are true, you know you're a human, you know all humans are mortal. So, because they are true, if you reach the conclusion, therefore I'm mortal, right? That has to be true, right? Because all humans are mortal and you're a human. So therefore, you must be mortal, right? So with deductive reasoning, you basically reach a conclusion that must be true, right? Because everything it's based on is also true. So that's the way you want to think of induction, is you're reaching these absolute conclusions based on specific information that you have validated, right, to be true. So that's deduction. So let's look at inductive reasoning. Okay, so with inductive reasoning, this is a logical process that draws a broad generalization from those specific observations. So you, once again, right, you're going to look at specific information points and you're going to reach a conclusion. Now, the difference here is that these conclusions usually are broader. They're just sort of generalized or are sweeping, a little far sweeping, and they're not always true. Okay. So these are not absolute conclusions. So, for example, if I notice that if I have a student, so let's say Tom is late to class a lot. So if in my head I take that information and I say every time they're late, I basically just determine like, well, Tom is always late to class. He was late Tuesday, he was late Thursday, and then I say, well, he's going to be late on next Tuesday's class. Okay. So that is a conclusion I'm reaching based on the information points that I have, right? So again, based on the data I have, I'm reaching the conclusion using that type of reasoning. So again, in the Tolman model, if you think of it that way, it's basically my conclusion is that Tom is going to be late next week. And my reasoning, since I don't have a ton of like clear evidence, since I don't know, of course, what he's going to do on a given day, right? So it's not like specific evidence that I know is always going to be true, right? My reason is that, well, he's been late in the past, and I've observed him being late in the past. So I'm going to connect those dots to draw the broad conclusion that he's probably going to be late next week, right? So that is inductive reasoning. So I reach this conclusion, but the conclusion isn't guaranteed to be true, right? Because it's just you're just making observations based on specific pieces of information and reaching a general conclusion. So that's inductive reasoning, not always a valid conclusion. You also have abduction. So abduction is something that people what you're doing here is you're drawing the most likely conclusion. So a good way to sort of think of this is like making an educated guess, okay, based on a situation. So, and we actually use abduction, even though you've probably heard that term less. A lot of us have heard the term inductive or deductive reasoning and abductive reasoning. Maybe, we even though we use this all the time, ironically, we use this a lot in our life. You probably actually haven't heard this term very much, right? But what it basically just means is you draw the most likely conclusion from a piece of information. You're just making an educated guess, right? So let's say I'm a doctor and Sarah's a patient. She comes in and I observe that Sarah has a runny nose, and I also observe that Sarah has a sore throat, right? So it'd be like if then I'm a doctor, I reach the conclusion that Sarah probably has a cold, right? Or she has a flu virus that's going around in my community. Now, could Sarah have all kinds of other ailments? Sure, right? Her symptoms could be the sign of a lot of other things, right? But I'm reaching this conclusion thinking it's the most likely scenario, right? It's most likely she has a cold or a flu than maybe some of the other things that these could be conditions of, right? And so you just take the information and you just reach a conclusion based on this is probably what's the scenario, right? This is probably what's going on here. This is what this usually means in this situation. So again, if you think about it, we do this throughout our lives, right? We do this a lot. So again, at least I haven't heard, you don't really hear in everyday vernacular the term abductive reasoning, but it's something that we do all the time. So again, if you want to think of all three of these, you want to think of inductive reasoning as you take specific pieces of information that once you confirm they're always true, those pieces of information, you reach a conclusion, therefore, that must be true, right? Because everything it's based on is true. So therefore, this conclusion must be true, right? All the time, every time. Deductive reasoning was when you take specific piece of information as well, but now you're reaching a conclusion that's more broad. It doesn't guarantee it's true, right? You're just saying, I think that this is probably true, right? This is the conclusion you believe, but it's not guaranteed to be true. So again, that example of the student who was late in the past doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be late in the future, right? So that's what you're doing with deductive reasoning. And then abduction is when you're drawing the most likely conclusion from pieces of information. So you have a variety of pieces of information, and you just sort of reach a conclusion based on, I think this is probably what we're looking at here, right? So you have these three really just broad general types of reasoning that you want to look for in everyday arguments, whether you're using them, whether they're being used against you, and decide if you're comfortable with them, right? Decide if they're valid arguments. But again, if you want to also think of this in the context of the Tolman model, right? You're reaching a conclusion. You still have all the same elements, right? You have a conclusion, but instead of like physical evidence or data, so to speak. Now you're getting sort of like data and reasoning connecting the conclusion, right? But there's still warrants, there's still assumptions in there that you're making, but these are the three broad types. Now let's look at some more like specific types of reasoning. I've mentioned some of these in other videos. I've talked about them a little bit, so I'm just going to sort of bring them up again here relatively quickly just to sort of like keep these in context as well. Is whether you're using deductive, inductive, or abductive reasoning, you also have scenarios where people use even more specific types of reasoning that can fall into all three of those categories or one of those categories, right? So you have causal reasoning. So this is again when you're looking at cause and effect relationships. You have reasoning by analogy, generalizations, and what's called sign reasoning. So causal reasoning, again, cause and effect relationships. What you have to be careful there is you have to make sure that, first of all, there's a true causal relationship going on. So sometimes things are correlated, but they're not causing each other. So, in other words, they both may go up. When one goes up, the other goes up, or when one goes down, the other goes down, or maybe when one goes up, one always goes down. But that doesn't mean they're causing each other. There's a cause and effect going on. They may be correlated for other reasons, right? So you need to make sure that you have a true cause and effect by eliminating other variables, looking at other dynamics that could be impacting the situation. Another problem is that sometimes you may identify something that indeed there's a cause and effect relationship, but it's really only a small factor. So it's like 5% of the issue, right? It's only causing 5%, and there's like bigger causes that you should be looking at, right? Bigger effects. So it also might be a situation where you're paying attention to something that really isn't that significant anyway, even if it is cause and effect. Reasoning by analogy is when you compare two situations or two cases. And I've mentioned this. You have to be careful because sometimes this can lead to thinking through in terms of a fallacy, essentially, where when you're going to compare two situations, you do need to make sure they're similar. At the point where those two situations are not similar, that's where your reasoning and your conclusion are going to end up being faulty and you're going to reach a poor conclusion. So you have to be careful about reasoning by analogy. Just make sure the two cases are similar and it's not a fallacy in the sense of it's a false analogy, right? Those two cases are not similar. Generalization. So this is reasoning where you're drawing a general rule from a specific instance. So you have one situation occur, and therefore you just draw a rule or a principle based on that. So, like one isolated case. Now, sometimes, look, you can learn from it. I mean, just everyday life, right? You learn, situation happens and you learn from it, and there's things you can take from it, and that's true, right? But you also have to be careful because sometimes there are situations that just aren't good examples that you really should not be drawing from. Okay. So, um, an example would be I teach interpersonal communication and I teach also some classes that are like survey of communication where we cover a lot of different communication topics. And for example, we have a section in there on organizational communication, workplace dynamics and communication, and relationships and communication. So let's take a workplace example. Let's say you start a job and it's in a field you really want to go into or some sort of career or job you really want to be successful at, and it doesn't go well, right? You struggle at the job, your boss is always nagging on you, yelling at you, and eventually you actually get fired. And the boss says, you know what, you got to work on your attitude, or you're not smart enough, you're just not getting this, right? You're not good at this. And they fire you. And so you have this one instance, right? And you take from that, well, I'm not good at this job, right? So it may be true, right? It's possible that you're not good at that. The boss said you can't handle it, right? Maybe you can't handle it. That might be true. But you know what also might be true? Like it may be a bad example. Like maybe they didn't train you well. Maybe your boss is just a jerk. Maybe they were looking for an excuse to fire you because they didn't want to pay you unemployment, so they didn't actually want to lay you off, right? And so, in other words, it could be just a bad example. Like again, I mentioned interpersonal communication. We have a section on relationships. Like this happens in relationships. People go into a relationship, they have a bad experience, they leave that relationship, and they go, well, see, this is what happens all the time, or this is what relationships are like, or this is how I deserve to be treated. Like, let's say again, it was a bad relationship, things didn't go well, you weren't treated well. It might just be like you were dating a jerk. That's possible, right? and you shouldn't take anything from it except for that they're an a-hole. Like, I mean, I don't, so you got to be careful sometimes. Like when you draw generalizations from specific instances, those specific instances, they might just be isolated cases, right? They might be the exception, not the rule, and you should not be modeling after them, right? You should not be drawing life lessons from them necessarily. So make sure like you consider those things, or sometimes just consider outside factors, right, that maybe make it a bad example. So sign reasoning. This is basically a type of thinking. This last one here about some other examples of this. There's a couple more, but sign reasoning is when you suggest a fact exists because there's a sign indicator. So this is one of those. Well, um, I got a sign of something or something that truly, might actually truly be an indicator of something. So therefore, it's like this must be true, right? Or it's true all the time. And that's not always the case. Like, for example, you might just be misreading it. It's not really a sign of what you think it is, right? Another issue might be, yeah, you read it like it was a true sign indicator, meaning it was proof of something, but it doesn't actually mean the conclusion's true, right? And so you have to also be careful about this. And the way to really be careful about it is you need to look for more than one sign indicator. In other words, when you see evidence of something, look for more than one piece of evidence, right? That's basically a way to validate, is this a sign of what I think it's a sign of, right? Um, so look for that, okay, to validate the conclusion. If you only see the one sign, then maybe that conclusion's not accurate, right? Now it could be, but like that makes it, of course, less likely. Okay, so that's what a sign indicator is. I guess an example of this would be like if you see let's say you're interested in somebody and romantically, right, and you hope that they're interested in you. And let's say this person, every time you talk to them, they're always like really talkative and have a big smile on their face. And you get the sense that maybe they're kind of flirting with you, right? So, look, generally people can sense when somebody's flirting with them. So, or showing interest, right, that way. And so that's a sign indicator. That's one sign. But let's say they also happen to have, excuse me, for some reason they have your phone number, right? So let's say you see, excuse me, whether you see them at work or you see them in other social, let's say you're part of the same study group. So they also have your phone number. So you get this sign indicator when you're with them, but they have your phone number as part of the study group, and they never seem to text you though, right? They never make any other overt sort of action to show a mutual like interest or an interest, right? So you're not getting the second sign indicator. Now, they might be interested in you and they're waiting for you to make a further move. That is true. So the conclusion may be true. But it also might not be true because you're not getting another sign indicator. So you just have to decide like if you're going to look for more or not. But obviously the way to validate the conclusion is to get more than one, sign indicator. So this is another specific type of reasoning. And then we get to, and I've mentioned this before in some other videos, you have what's called scientific, legal, and religious reasoning. So scientific reasoning is when you basically apply the scientific method. So this is somebody who um, has a theory, they test that theory, they look for physical evidence, right? They then try to repeat that process, get the same evidence, right, and see if it's repeatable, right? And if it's repeatable and you're validating it through actual evidence, right, observable results, you follow the scientific method, then you use that to reach conclusions essentially. So scientific reasoning is obviously one that's very common. Again, the advantage of this is it forces you to be objective, right, and look for physical evidence, look for repeatable results before you reach conclusions. Then you get to legal reasoning, and this doesn't mean laws. This means reasoning based on applying a principle or a rule to a conclusion or a decision. So this is, again, if you take the life principle, honesty is the best policy, right? Always do your best. You can't have a $1 million dream with a minimum wage work ethic. You ever heard that phrase? Can't have $1 million dream with a minimum wage work ethic. All that is a fancy way of saying do your best, work hard, right? So if you apply that principle to your life, that's like legal reasoning, right? Where you just decide I have a rule that I follow, and that's how I live my life. Now, if you do that, like that one particular, like always doing your best, always working hard, that principle is probably going to serve you well in life, right? So the advantage to this is it can force you to kind of stay focused on like true to yourself essentially, right? To your core values and beliefs if you just like apply these principles to your life. The disadvantage can be the principle could be outdated. It could be the type of thing that's not actually serving your life well. So on one hand, in your head, it's like, well, it sounds good, like this is how I want to live my life, but you're just not happy, right? And so you do have to be careful about this. Like, ask yourself, is these principles that I am sort of, for lack of a better term, like slavishly devoted to, like, is it serving you well, right? Because if it's not, that might not be a good idea to continue to apply that line of thinking. Religious reasoning is basically reasoning based on theology, right? So if you're religious, and now the advantage to that is and I've mentioned this before too in another video that from an academic standpoint, there's people that will argue that whether you, even if all the world's religions are wrong, right? Let's say their theology is not correct, that they still have a useful purpose to humanity, and in that they import a moral code, right? If you think about it, all these other types of reasoning don't force you to actually like treat people well and not be a bad human, right? Like you can be the mad scientist. Your life principles could be I just look out for me and screw everybody else, right? Religious reasoning actually imports a moral code, right? Like all the world's religions are like, let's be nice to people, let's not be jerks, right? Care about other people. And so that's the advantage of it, is that it does create a sense of ethics, right? And obviously the disadvantage is if the theology is wrong, but it does create a sense of ethics, right? And so that's the advantage of it, right? And again, I've mentioned this before too, that like I know like obviously there's good things and there's bad things that have been done in the name of religion. And sometimes people will go, well, wait a minute, what about all the, you say religious reasoning has the advantage of a moral code and treat people well, but look at all the blood and tears that have been shed in the name of religion. Well, you have to separate the practice from the theology, right? Keep in mind that a lot of the bad stuff you see is really how people choose to practice it. It's not stuff that's actually in the doctrine. So, those are two separate things. So it doesn't change the fact that, all of those religions still at their core say to be good to people, and that creates a moral code. So anyway, just a little side note about that. But these are all more specific types of reasoning that people will apply. So hopefully I'm sure you've recognized some of those. I'm sure we all use those at different levels and aspects in our life. And sometimes, of course, we mix them based on the situation, like what type of thinking we use. Now, there are also some basic sort of common reasons that we have biases in our reasoning, as it turns out, right? Where we reach these inaccurate conclusions. Now, look, there's a ton of these. In this course, whether it's this topic or some of these other topics like fallacies and things like that, I'm trying to talk about kind of like the heavy hitters, the big ticket items, the things that are the most common, right? So here are some common reasons why we have biases, and these are biases either in how we gather the evidence, the data, the premises that the pieces of information that we use to form our final conclusions or reasoning, or sometimes they're just like biases that occur in our conclusion. Like in other words, maybe we gathered the information correctly, or the data is all true, but we still reach a broad conclusion that's wrong or something like that. So it could be at both levels. Either we didn't gather the information correctly, or we gathered it correctly in the information and we reached the conclusion that's bad, right? So there's like all these ways it can break down to reach a bad conclusion or a faulty conclusion is what I'm trying to say. So let's look at what happens. So you have selective exposure, selective retention, some of the most common ones. Confirmation bias and framing. Okay. So selective exposure and selective retention. Selective exposure, looking only at information that will confirm one's prior attitudes. So this is the classic situation where we have a tendency to, if there's a topic and you could believe A or B, we tend to only expose ourselves to side A. Like we don't look at the other side at all. And all that does is create a feedback loop where the only inputs of information you're getting. So that's what a feedback loop is basically what's giving you information, right? Where it's all just confirming your pre-existing belief. So an example would be people that, let's say they follow national politics, right? And let's say you're politically conservative. So those people, they follow the news, they're conservative leaning. They go home, they watch Fox News, and that's all they watch, right? Or they watch they stream other conservative news shows, they listen to conservative podcasts, and that's all they're exposed to, right? Which is just going to tell them information that they like to and want to hear, that they're right on their worldview. And the vice, because Fox News is known to be very conservative leaning. Now the reverse happens too. Let's say you follow the news and you're politically liberal. That person has a tendency to every night and every day as they go about their day, they turn on MS Now, right? And they watch because MS Now, formerly MSNBC, is known to be a very liberal news network, right? And they listen to liberal news shows or stream liberal shows and listen to liberal podcasts and YouTube channels and things like that, right? And so you're only exposing yourself to information that agrees with you. And this is definitely a pet peeve of mine. There are certain topics where, like, you hear people talk about it, or I'll be on YouTube and I'm seeing a video about this topic, and the person is talking about their viewpoint on it, and they're criticizing the other side, and they know nothing about the side that they're criticizing. They have no education in it, no background in it, and they're sitting here taking pot shots at it. And I'm just thinking, you know nothing about that topic. Or not only sometimes just the topic in general. Like, you have your viewpoint, and you've just like exposed yourself to stuff that says you're right on that, but you don't even have a good fundamental basis of the topic, yet alone the other side, right? And this is because of our selective exposure tendencies. So this is just a common practice, and look, it's hard to listen to stuff that might make you uncomfortable. That doesn't mean you have to do that, right? Like, so for example, I mean, I have opinions about the world and the news and things like that. And there are certainly certain shows or programs that I'm just not going to watch because I think they're full of crap. So I think it's a complete waste of my time. They don't deserve, right, for me to pay attention to them in any way because I think they're going to do nothing but give me misinformation and just spew a lot of awful things. And I'm not going to listen to it, right? But that being said, it doesn't mean I do that for some things, but I'm not going to totally tune out the other side either, right? It doesn't mean I don't listen to anything on that side. I'm just selective, right? Based on what I think is legitimate information on the other side of an issue. So the way to avoid selective exposure, again, it doesn't mean you got to give everybody um, a seat at the table to express their viewpoint on the other side if you find that information to be truly distasteful. But what it does mean is at least explore what the other side of an issue is or the counter arguments before you form an opinion, right? So that's selective exposure, where you only look at one side of an issue, and this is really, really common. Selective retention. Now, this is a lesser known one, but what this is basically dealing with is we also tend to only remember information that confirms our beliefs. It's crazy, right? So we will get, let's say you believe, like, you could believe A or B on an issue, and you believe A, and you get three pieces of information that tell you A. Like, they kind of like confirm A is true, right? And you get two pieces of information that tell you B is true. You are likely over time to just forget those two pieces of information that told you B is true and only remember A. So we actually tend to only hold on to examples or remember things that confirm how we want to remember or view something, right? So it's like we only remember the good and not the bad sometimes, and or the side that we want to sort of fall on. So you got to be careful about that. That's selective retention. It's lesser known, but it's actually really, really common. I'm going to come to confirmation bias last. I think it's actually the most interesting and that you see out there. But framing, just to kind of quickly dispose of that, framing is when you present information from a strategic angle. So this is like purposely trying to spin it, right? So this is, I get information, and like it's an issue that could be like both sides of an issue, and they're like there's two sides, right? And look, there's a lot of issues like that where there's logical, rational arguments on both sides, and that's why we're divided on it, right? Um, and let's say I believe I'm pro or con, like I'm one side of this, to where then I purposely present it to you in a way to make you be pro or to make you be con based on the side that I'm on, right? So that is spin, that is framing something. I guess a way to look at that would be like if I take a picture, the picture is the truth, but if I want you to think that that place is really beautiful, it's like, let's say I Photoshop the picture, right? Or do some like alter it that way, right? To like, it's like if I take a picture of a mountain, that's a true picture. It's a true representation. But if I start to Photoshop it, right, that changes the picture, right? Or that. So think of spin or frame as just sort of uh, of altering the truth a little bit to fit the side that you're on. Now it doesn't have to be that. That's like just one example. I guess the picture example, it's probably not a good. I got to come up with a better example, I guess. But a frame can be either. Hey, you could fall. Look at it this way. A frame could be, or spinning something is essentially. It could be a variety of things. So first of all, just from the truth, right? It could be the truth, and I just only present to you the truth that's going to make you fall on the side of the issue I want you to fall on, or to believe what I want you to believe on, right? Now, it could be the truth and partially a little bit of a lie. That's where I was kind of going with that Photoshop thing, where hey, it's a real picture, but I've added some, sprinkled some lie on top of that, right, with the Photoshop. Okay, where I kind of like add a little bit to it to try to get you to, again, adopt a certain viewpoint. And by the way, one of the reasons that it's hard to tell if somebody's like spinning something or framing something is because, especially if you don't have access to all the information or you don't fully know or understand a topic, when somebody mixes a piece of a lie and the truth, it's really hard to tell where the truth ends and the lie begins, right? Because you don't have all the information. You're relying, right? Maybe you're even relying on them for the information, right? Or you don't know the topic, or you don't have access to all the information, right? And so you can get away with this because they will, and oftentimes when people are doing this on purpose, what they do is they take some pieces of truth that I know that you know are true, and then I add my lies on top of it to shape your opinion, right? Or my like slants on top of it to shape your opinion. Because again, it's hard to kind of tell where did the truth end and the lie begin. And one little note I will say on this is, in today's age, we hear all this talk about how so much information out there in the information ecosystem it's all spin, or like we see this with journalism now. Like people say all news is biased and it's just terrible, and they're all spinning things and they all have agendas. First of all, that is just fundamentally way overblown. They're not all biased. They don't all have agendas. Okay? Um, that is very illogical and irrational if you're going to go there, reach that kind of conclusion. So first of all, let's consider a couple of things. You do realize that all of these journalists and all these people that work at these networks, you do know they're from all over the country. And they went to college a lot of different places. They were trained a lot of different places. And a lot of them have worked for both sides of networks that you think are liberal or conservative. They've worked both places. So the odds of them all coming together in some grand conspiracy, right, to shape public opinion, that'd be a pretty hard one to pull off. Because some of them are from Texas and some are from California working together. Explain that one. They all came together in this conspiracy, right? They're all from different places. They all have different backgrounds, right? It's kind of, in other words, when there's that many moving parts, kind of hard for there to be a big conspiracy, but for them all to be in on it. So look, they're not all just biased. Now that being said, they're just trying to report stuff, right? And by the way, just because you don't like what somebody reports doesn't make it biased. Just because you don't like the truth doesn't mean the truth isn't true, right? If I describe the duck and tell you it's a duck, just because you don't like that it's a duck doesn't make it not a duck. It doesn't make it biased. It doesn't make it false. It doesn't make it fake because you don't want to hear it, right? That's another problem we have, right? Is that people just, I mean, it's a bigger problem in our society because unfortunately, we have this situation going on where there's just no accountability for anything. But look, I think that's really overblown. This whole like, it's not realistic that all of these journalists are slanted and trying to like spin things and all have agendas, because again, they all come from different backgrounds and experiences. For them to all get together on this just isn't very realistic. And again, I also think we have this problem of people just because they don't like what they're hearing, they don't like the truth. That truth must be false. right? Now, okay, that being said, I think it's overblown. Now, that being said, for those of you who hate the news, I will say this. And by the way, part of my background in communication is heavily like studying mass communication, media theories, and things like that. So I do have some background in this. Now, I will say this for those of you that don't like a lot of the spin you see in the news. Are there networks and shows and programming and podcasts and you name it, right? YouTube channels that are absolutely biased and spinning things and have agendas? Yes, you are correct. They are out there, absolutely. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It absolutely exists, right? Absolutely. It's just it's not every news network. It's not every outlet. It's not every reporter. Right. It's so that's what I'm trying to say. But yes, that does exist. I'm not saying that's not a thing. It absolutely is a thing. It's bad. But it's not as like widespread as I think people like to kind of like act like. It's out there, it's a problem. It's not everybody, I guess what I'm trying to say. So okay, so confirmation bias. So I think this one's really interesting, but like so and again, this one happens a lot. What confirmation bias is you already have an opinion, like you think A, and you get information that's kind of ambiguous, right? Like it could be A or B, and you interpret it as A because that's what you want to believe, right? So it's kind of like, I mean, in fact, in classes, I'll sometimes show this video. I mean, it's a sketch, so they're kind of like just laughing at this scenario, but it's sort of like, let's say you're interested in somebody and you interact with them, and you think maybe they're flirting with you. You're not quite sure, but you kind of think maybe they are. So in that scenario, the person who I'm interested in the other person, I think maybe they're flirting with me. You are more likely to, because you like them and you want them to like you, excuse me, anything ambiguous you do, you are more likely to interpret that as, well, they like me. They're flirting with me, right? Excuse me. Because that's the conclusion you want to reach. That's what confirmation bias is. So it's this natural tendency we have to interpret information as confirming the prior belief, right? And because we lean that way, that can skew our conclusions, right? We can reach conclusions that aren't accurate. And you see this all the time where people, they already kind of lean a certain way, and every piece of evidence they get, they're like, well, see, it's proof of this. See, it's proof of this, right? And that's not necessarily true because, again, if you're going to be logical or rational in any situation, like let's say you get a piece of evidence and it could mean, let's say your prior belief is thing one. You think thing one is true. And you get this piece of information, and it could mean thing one, and it could mean thing two, and it could mean thing three, right? Um, if you were going to be logical and rational, what you would do is you would eliminate thing one, you would look at thing two, and you would look at thing three. You would look at all of the possible outcomes, and then after looking at all of that, you would reach a conclusion, right? You would then make the determination. But a lot of times, what happens with confirmation bias is people just jump to conclusions. So in other words, I get this piece of information. It could mean these three things. I already lean thing one. That's what I believe is true. And so therefore, I'm just going to interpret it as proof of thing one, right? Well, see, that's proof of it, right? See? And it might not be proof of that. You might be like not truly giving the other options of what this piece of evidence could be, what outcomes it could lead you to because of your bias, because you want so badly to believe thing one, right? Or just because you at your core just fundamentally believe thing one. So that's confirmation bias. It's really common. Just we get ambiguous stuff, and so we just like look for some way to fit it into our belief system, our narrative, or whatever we think is true. So obviously, there's all kinds of other things that can, bias our reasoning, bias our thinking, bias conclusions, right? Like that just can create all kinds of problems. If you go back to the Tolman model of an argument where you have a conclusion and you've got evidence, data, reasoning, like some way that you're supporting the conclusion, or with reasoning, not only supporting it, but reasoning is really what we've been talking about in this video. Is it's either supporting the conclusion or connecting, right, evidence to the conclusion. And then you've got the warrant. Look, there are all kinds of things that can bias your conclusion, or that can bias the way you're connecting the dots, the reasoning that can bias how you interpret evidence, or even biases that can like color your warrants, the assumptions you're making in a situation, right? Um, and So you just have to be aware of that, right? That all of these things can lead an argument to be faulty. And again, I'm just pointing out there's more. Really, what we've been talking about today are some of the most common ones. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in a future video.